In the next two lectures, we're going to look at how we put event listeners or callbacks into our WebGL applications. In this lecture, we'll primarily be concerned with graphical devices that we create in mostly buttons, menus, how we use the keyboard. Well, that's a physical device. And next lecture, we'll look at how we get mouse input, which will be a little different because we'll be getting a position back and we have to figure out how to use that position. We'll also in the next lecture talk about window style events, like what happens when you move the corner of a window and change its size. That's known as a reshape event. But what we'll do is we'll use the example of the rotating square again, and we'll start adding devices and interaction to that example, and I'll show you that as we go along. All of these examples are in the code for Chapter 3 on the website. Okay, let's start by adding a button to our code, and there are multiple ways to do that, but the idea is that what I want to do, however I implement that, there are various ways of where you put the code in the HTML file or in the JavaScript file, or some of it in each, which is going to be our preferred strategy. But in any case, what we're trying to do in our first example is I want to add a button, and every time I click that button, it's going to change the direction of rotation of that cube. So that's a pretty simple thing to do. And if you look at the render function, it's really just adding a new variable direction, which we can initialize somewhere outside of our init function, so it'll be global, and start off with a true, and then every time I push the button, what it's going to do is change direction from true to false or false to true. If it's true, I'll increment theta each time I go through the render loop, and if it's false, I'll decrease theta. So a very, very simple action that I can add. The problem is, how do I get the value of direction, or really the value of true or false, back from pushing this button with our mouse? Well, let's do it this way. In HTML, there's a button element for the canvas, and we can use it just as we would our other tags in the HTML file and give it an ID. And again, the ID is so that we can refer to it back in our application in the JavaScript file. We want to indicate something about what that button does, so what the default will do is let us put some text inside of that button, and that's what change rotation direction does. And that's really all we need in the HTML file to get started. Now that's going to be a default button that within HTML there are very simple defaults for the things like buttons and menus, which you may think are kind of ugly, and generally what you would do is either write some more HTML, or what would probably be more likely if you were a web programmer is you would use a package like CSS, which is pretty standard, or jQuery, which is real popular for input, to make the button a little more prettier. It might have color. You might want to change the border. You might want to play with the text. And we're not going to worry about that because that's all web issues, and we're trying to stay away from them and concentrate on graphics. So we'll just put the default button up there on the display. And then what I have to do now is say, well, it's going to generate an event. Every time I click on that button with my mouse, a button event, or actually a click event, is generated because I'm clicking the button by clicking on my mouse button, and that's known as a click event. And as we'll see, it could be generated by other devices. But we generate a click event, but we're not doing anything with it unless we define an event listener or a callback. So let's look at a very simple event listener for the button. So what we'll do is use the function getElementById, which returns that ID which I assigned to it, called the direction button. Back here in this code, it was called direction button, so I can refer to it by that. Notice that get element by ID is a method within the document object. The document is the global document that we create in our HTML file. So I define a variable, which is what is returned by document get element by ID, and now I define an event listener, which is I add an event listener to that variable, and what it is now going to respond to the click event, which is a standard event which is known, and it'll now execute a function which all it does is change direction from true to false or false to true. That's it, and then plus those couple of lines I already showed you that we put in the render function. Now you can actually do this in a number of ways. Here's another way you can do it that's all sort of condenses everything into one line that just says document get by element, but that has a method in it which is on click, and then I could just say, okay, on click, execute this function which I defined, and all it does, I don't have to name it, that simply changes directions Boolean value. A couple other ways we can do that is we can add an event listener, and suppose we want to use what we want to do is use a multi-button mouse, and what I want to be able to do is say, well, I only want to use the left button, which is assigned a value of 0. So within that event is a parameter button, which returns a number, 0 for the left button. I think 1 is the right button, and 2 would be the middle button if you have a 3-button mouse. And then just say, okay, now my function, all it does is say, well, it looks at the button, which one it is, and it says if it's the left button, then change the directions value. You can also do things if you have a single button mouse and say, well, I can use some keyboard input. So I can say with that event, not only can I look at which key it is, I can actually look at the meta keys on my keyboard. And so one of which is shift key. So with the event is a parameter that's returned automatically called whether the shift key is pushed down or not. And I could say if it's pushed down, then flip the direction. So you can do a lot of different things like that. You also can do it all within the HTML file. It just says within the HTML file, instead of just defining an ID that goes back to the JavaScript file, you can say, well, I'll do it all in the HTML file and say, here's a button element, and now within that button element, there's an on-click defined, and it says, well, if on-click is true, then what I'm going to do is change, if on-click happens, excuse me, what I'm going to do is change direction. That goes in the HTML file. The reason I am not doing it that way is we've made this decision that we're trying to separate the graphics from what the page looks like. So I'm trying to say, okay, the button is defined in the HTML file, which defines that there is a button, and it will go on a place on the page which is relative to where I define the button and where I define other elements like the canvas. Or I can change the position using a little more HTML, and then have what that button does be placed in the JavaScript file, and that's the tactic we'll take. But if you're a web program, you say, well, I can all do it in one line in the HTML file because that's part of the page. Now, let me do a little more with that before I show you an example. So suppose not only do we want to change the direction of rotation, I want to play with the rotation speed. Now, we talked about that a little bit last time, where we talked about the timeout function, where we can put a delay into a program. So suppose I set the delay globally to be 100 milliseconds, and then in the render function, I put my rendering, exactly what I was doing before, inside of the timeout function. So what the timeout function does is say, okay, what I'm going to do is request an animation frame. That is what makes it recursive and will render as soon as it can. I'll clear the buffer. I'll use theta as before. If it's true, it'll increase. If it's false, it'll decrease. I'll get a uniform variable. I'll send that uniform variable over to the vertex shader, and I'll draw the triangle strip as we did before. The difference here is now I have this delay in here. It says, wait 100 milliseconds before you go through the loop again. And that allows me to change the speed by using buttons to increase or decrease the speed of rotation. So I can now have a button that says, okay, if you push me, increase the delay. If you push this other button, decrease the delay. So let's look at that, and this is all in the notes, but I want to take a little bit of a look at this. Let's see if we can do this correctly. So let's go and look at our browser, and here's the chapter 3 code. Now this rotating square 1, I probably should have showed it to you last time. This is the rotating square doing the best it can. This is as fast a rotation as you can get because the browser is only going to go at about 60 frames a second maximum. Now let's go back and look at another version. So this is where we were at the last lecture. Here's our first implementation using some buttons. So here's the thing rotating, and now here's our change rotation direction. Okay, rotating clockwise, now rotating counterclockwise. Now we're going to talk about if I want to spin faster or slower, I can use a button, put 2 more buttons in here to increase or decrease the rotation speed. But actually, I'd rather do that with a menu. So let's now talk about menus, and then I'll come back. And actually, let's look at the example now. So using a menu, I have 3 lines in it. The first line is doing exactly what this button does, which says change the direction of rotation. Now here's 2 other entries in that menu that change the delay in that code that I just showed you. So this should spin it faster. It's doing that. Each time it's doubling the speed. It's using double buffering, so you never see a partial display. That's pretty good. Now I can slow it down each time I click this button. What I'm going to do is slow it down by a factor of 2. So it's better to do this with a menu, I think, than to do it with having all of these buttons all over the place. So how do I do that? Notice that both of these are graphical devices. Both of them are using the same left button on my mouse. So, well, you can't see that, but take my word for it. And notice also that these are the default menu style and the default button style, which are okay. We can do better, but for what we're doing, this is just fine. Also, because of how we put them in the HTML file and look at the code, that because we define the button in the menu first, it's going on the left, and over here is the window or the canvas element that I define. Now we could change that around. You'll see that a little bit later. But anyhow, this is our first attempt to make that a little bit better. Now let's go back and look at how we get those menus in there. So let's come back to our slides and look at menus. Okay, so a menu in HTML is a select element, which we now can define its style and its placement within the HTML file. It has a bunch of entries in it, which are called the options, and each option, when they're clicked on, will return a value which I can get back to, which I can do something with or get back to the JavaScript file. So here's the code for that. You give it an ID, so you can get that menu information back to the JavaScript file. Size tells you how many entries are going to go in that menu, and then the value is going to correspond to each line. So the first line is going to return a value of 0. We'll put toggle rotation direction inside of the menu on that line. That X is just extraneous, doesn't belong here. Option for the second line says the line in the menu will say spin faster, and the third entry in the menu will say spin slower and correspond to an option value of 2. So that's, again, pretty straightforward. This describes the element, and every time I click, there's an event that occurs that returns one of these values, but I need the event listener, which will actually look for them and actually do something with them. So here's a corresponding event listener that goes inside of the JavaScript code. So again, get document element by ID says, well, here's the ID I assigned to it in my menu, and add an event listener. Again, it's the click function, but instead of using a button, this is going to now look at the click event as returning something called selected index, which is the value of the value variable, and now we can use a switch in a case statement to now first line will change the direction, second line will slow it down by, speed it up by shortening the delay by a factor of 2. The third entry will increase the delay by a factor of 2 and therefore slow it down, and this is exactly what I showed you in that example. Now we can also do it another way and say, well, if you're going to do it this way, how about using the keyboard? I may want to use my mouse for other things because this sort of takes up some of what I would do with the left button. What if I want to use the keyboard for that? So let me give you a couple of ways of using the keyboard, and then I'll go back and look at the code. So let's look at using the key down. Now every time you press a key, you're going to generate what's called a key down event. You don't have to put anything in the HTML file for that because the keyboard is assumed to be there, and so now all I have to do is define a listener that says, what do you do if a key is pressed down? Or more specifically, you're only going to look at certain keys. If I don't have this listener, I can always press various keys and then nothing is going to happen in my canvas. It's only the particular keys that I depress that are going to have events that I respond to. And in this case, let's use the 1, 2, and 3 key to do it. Now, here's a sort of a basic way to do it. I'll give you another way in a second, which says, well, if you know the Unicode, now each key has a code. You know, it used to be ASCII code that was expanded to eventually to Unicode, so it can encompass more languages within it. And an old ASCII, if you're familiar with ASCII, is embedded within it and has the same numbering. So if you look up an ASCII table or a Unicode table and say, well, what is the 1 key? It's number 49, and the 2 key is 50, and the 3 key is 51. So if you know that information, then you could say, okay, 1 does exactly what the first entry in that menu did. It switches the direction, and 2 changes the delay to make it go faster, and 3 makes it go slower. But then you say, well, I don't know Unicode. I want to really do something a little bit better than that. And it turns out there's a function in HTML which will help you do that, which all this one does is now tell you that given the key code, what is the actual string that you get back. So key code 49 will give you the string 1, key code 50 will, 0, key code 2 will give you, no, actually I'm using 1, 2, 3. Key code 49 will give you a 1, key code 50 will give you a 2, the string 2, and key code 51 will give you the string 3. So now I don't have to know Unicode. I could just say, if I got a 1 back, then change the direction of rotation. If I got a 2 back, make it faster. If I got a 3 back, make it slower. So this is actually, I think, a preferable method for us because I don't want to have to keep looking up the key code. So here's a very simple event listener. You can stick that in. And the example I'll go back to after I talk about sliders for a second. Now I can have all of those working at the same time. I could use a menu. In the example you'll see, I can use the menu to change a direction. I could use a button to change a direction. I could use the keyboard. And if I want to change the speed, I can either use the menu, the keypad, or if I want to get a continuous change, then I'd like to have a different element on there, which is called a slider. And so a slider is very, very nice. It just puts a little slider with something you can move with your mouse by holding your mouse down and sliding it back and forth, which is going to return an identifier of that slider. And what you want to do when you put the slider on the page, so it's one of these things where again you're going to put a new element on the page, which is the slider element. And what you want to do now is say, well, what are the minimum and maximum values of that slider? So I'm going to have to specify them. And I want to say, well, how much do I have to slide that thing to actually generate an event? I don't want to be generating events infinitely fast or as fast as the system can handle them. I want to say I have to move that slider a minimum step size using the size variable to say if you move that amount, then you're going to generate an event. And I also can specify where we are initially. So the initial value, usually you'll put it somewhere in the middle. Now there's one more tag I want to introduce, which is the division tag, which just allows you to sort of separate things. So if I put the division tag in there, it'll then push this slider up or down depending on where this is in the HTML file. So I can put a slider above or below the canvas. Same thing with menus and buttons, and it's helpful to be able to organize your page very simply. So here's one. Now so I do a division element. Now this text on the left is going to appear. It's just text. It's not within a tag, so it's going to come out, and that's going to be on the left of the element that I'm putting over here, and on the right I'm going to put 100, so it says the speed is going to go between 100% and 0% and a maximum of 100%. Now here's the type. Again, I give it an ID so I can refer to it in the JavaScript code. The type is called a range element in HTML, and it has variables, the minimum, the maximum, which I set, the step size, which I'm going to set as being 10. So I have sort of 10 values that I can put in, and I'm going to start the slider off in the middle. Okay, so it's pretty straightforward to put sliders up, and we'll see examples later when we do 3D where we have lots of sliders to control all kinds of different things. Now, what does the listener look like? Turns out the listener is just a single line that says, it generates an event, which is a new event, which is called, again, get element by ID to get the slider element, and that has a parameter in it which is onChange, which says if there's an onChange event. Now, onChange is generated whenever I go at least size, and it will now return the value back to the program or back to the JavaScript file or to the listener, and it says the delay now is the value that's returned when there's an onChange event. So it's a simple little one-line little listener, but it'll do what we need done. And so let's now finish by looking back at the example. So let's go back to the website, and let's look at rotating square 3 here. That's the code. I don't want to look at the code. You can look at the code. I want to look at the HTML file. Here we go. So here we are again. Here's what we had before, just to show you that I can do this three or different ways. I also have the key in here, so I'm going to be hitting the 1, 2, and 3 key. I just hit the 1 key, the 2 key to speed it up, the 3 key to slow it down, just to prove what I showed you worked. Here's the menu that still works, the button still works. But here's the new element I added, the slider element. And now you see that here's the code that was on before the slider element was defined, and it's just putting speed to say what it is, going from 0, and on the right I have 100, from 0% to 100%. And here's the actual slider. I'm holding the left button of the mouse down, and see I'm slowing it down, speeding it up. So this is a wonderful little element, doesn't take much to add. So with the exception of now being able to get positions back from the mouse, you can do an awful lot to control your applications with just these 3 simple, actually 4 including the keyboard. Listeners are very simple. For those of you who have done OpenGL before with C++ in one of the libraries, or you've done any interactive programming, this is incredibly simple to do. It's much easier than doing things within a Unix system or an X window kind of system. So next lecture we'll be talking about how you get positional input from the mouse and how you might use that input.